Lucky you.
36 best
Tuned
holes in
into
golf.
Alternate Shots podcast,
Barney's Army.
where we talk about golf,
Sandy.
poker,
James Bond.
horse racing,
Double.
classic movies.
Zenyatta.
We have no script,
Down the stretch they
and we
come.
are glad you joined us.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
What's not to like?
So that's the
I,
view when you come out of the locker room, Cody, and you take a
oh
right.
yeah, I know it well, Bob. Here, I'll
Yeah.
give you. You could use this if you wanted it too. I
Look at
dug
that.
this. This is our coffee table book right by the bar here. You can almost.
You got the Doug Smith, the Wingfoot story, Cody. You got the right book.
That's right, man.
When you have friends to come to Wingfoot, you tell them to go on eBay and buy that book because they will. It's worth every penny.
Yeah,
Well, Billy Regan, we're really lucky today. I would like to get started by thanking Cody Gifford for coming on our Alternate Shots podcast. I think this is episode 32, and we're really kind of branching out because, as you know, Billy and I like to talk about classic movies, and we hope to dive into that. But welcome to the show. We're really appreciate it and look forward to hearing your stories today.
Thanks
Absolutely.
for having
Welcome
me.
aboard, Cody. It's a pleasure to meet you and get to know you.
Likewise, likewise.
So, Cody, what's going on in your life these days? I know that you're a new father and love the Wingfoot hat. What tell Billy and I
Oh
what's
yeah.
going on?
I got this actually. This was an impulse buy last time I played with Rob. And we were walking out. I was about to drive home, and I kind of looking at the shop, corner of my eye. And I said, "All right, I got to go in there for old time's sake." And Rob had just bought a bunch of stuff for Frankie. We had just had the baby, and I think it was the first time I had been out of the house in whatever it was, 3 or 4 months. And Billy, I don't know if you have kids, but Bob, certainly you can appreciate the first time you're let out of the house after you've been home and helping with the baby, and your life has been turned upside down in the best possible way. To get out and walk around Wingfoot with one of your best pals is maybe there's not a word in the English language that accurately describes the joy and the amount of fun that we had that day. And I don't even know if there was a question in there somewhere, but fatherhood and running my own little company, the little engine that could. We can get into the media stuff of all it. Billy, you were just telling me a little bit about your background, and really interested to hear some more stories, the war stories from Channel 9.
There were a lot of interesting days at Channel 9. We had some good directors. You know, they were TV directors. They knew their jobs, but they were hilarious. One of them, John Wolfe, rest in peace, really taught me a lot. I think his favorite lines were all insulting.
Uh-huh.
You know, it was never like, geez, it's good having you out there. It's like, does that camera move? I understand they have wheels on those things. And one of his favorite lines was when you made a mistake on Romper Room or something like that. You don't get two chances in live TV.
You guys operate in that world. They're not saying it. Give us the sense of what that director's saying to you. Is he yelling at your ear? Is he just, what's going on there?
Depending on what the show is, Romper Room, for instance, he's telling one. There's two cameras that he's directing, as well as any kind of tape roll-ins that they might be adding in, whether it's a Babar cartoon or whatever. But mostly he's telling the camera, I need a shot of the kids. How come I don't have a shot of the kids? Somebody got to include Molly in the shot. She's walking off the set, move truck to your left. The camera has wheels. So it's frantic. It doesn't sound like it's frantic when it's going on, but it is because it's all immediate and it has to be done in a timely fashion or you look like a bunch of idiots.
Yeah.
And my maybe my third day on camera on Romper Room, and it was live. They're marching around Miss Marianne, and all the kids are following her, and I'm supposed to keep Marianne and the kids in the shot. So I pan the camera past the set limits instead of moving. This is where I learned I'm supposed to move the camera, and it revealed the lighting director and two other stagehands who had a scoop light on a table, and they were doping out a racing form. So that was now on Romper Room, with the director yelling in my ear,
Uh-huh.
freezing me up, adding longevity to the mistake, and go to break, fuck the commercial, get that hell.
Uh-huh.
That was a good
And where
day.
where was the studio?
Times Square. literally right across from One Times Square where they dropped the ball.
And what was Times Square? This was what year now?
This was for me from 78 to 88, about 78 to 86. Then
Gotcha.
maybe 87, they moved over to Secaucus, New Jersey. Channel 9 had their license was being challenged by some group that wanted to take over the TV station.
Mm.
And by some miracle, New Jersey passed a law that, or got Bill Barry, I think was the senator at the time, got a law passed in Congress that any state that didn't have an existing FCC license would get one, unconditional if a TV station moved there. So we hopped over to Jersey, which didn't have a license. We chased away the lawsuit. Yeah.
What's your experience behind the camera or giving orders to Cody?
Ooh. I think I've gotten more orders in my life than I've given, frankly. I mean, it's funny. It brings me back to the TV side of it and on the studio side. Bob, I don't know if you even remember this. When I was about, it would have been about maybe 7th or 8th grade. Billy, did you remember a gentleman named Albert Primo? Al T. Primo?
Don't know the name.
Eyewitness News. He was the mastermind behind Eyewitness News.
Okay.
And he came to my father, I think it was, back when I was 7th, 8th grade. And he said that he wanted to develop an eyewitness news for kids. And he was looking for, he was kind of going around to the usual suspects, I guess, in New York, and going to their progeny, their kids, and saying, hey, is this something you'd be interested in auditioning for and pursuing? And I really had no experience with broadcasting other than my mom pulling me on to Live with Regis and Kathy Lee or whatever it was at the time. But they were looking for a sportscaster, and my dad encouraged me to do it and kind of get out of my comfort zone a little bit. And it ended up being a blast. I did it for about maybe 2.5 years. And I think the show ended up being called Eyewitness Teen Kids News, which is a mouthful. And if I'm not mistaken, it could still be syndicated. I think I saw an advert for it the other day. It still exists in one way, shape, or form. But I had a wonderful.
You got a good taste of the studio life then.
At a very early age, yes, and I did, right. I alluded to, with everything with my mom, that was, being on set was not particularly foreign to me, right? But to be in the hot seat and to show up and to work and get a paycheck and
read a teleprompter.
Read a prompter and to have deductions from that paycheck and to learn what taxes are when you're 13 or 14. And it's funny the things you really remember, right? But, and too, some of my I wasn't a host, but I was the resident sportscaster. And God bless Al, may he rest in peace. He passed away recently, but he gave me the green light to go ahead, and I did some stand-ups. I wrote some of my own pieces, which was a lot of fun. And again, I'm 32 now, I'm soon to be 33. So this is going way back for me. But we drive in with Dad, going into Manhattan when we were little. And that was a fun experience. And then also, reading the prompter. And I had braces at the time. And I remember the first time I was up there trying to enunciate, and the director, I forget his name, is kicking me. I didn't think we were going to talk about this, but he comes over to me and he was telling me about a very famous Greek or orator, right? And I don't know which one it was, but he was making me feel good about how he used to practice his speeches in the symposium or wherever he was delivering speeches or debates. And he would put these pebbles in his mouth and he would practice enunciating and pronunciating with these pebbles in his mouth. So it's kind of like a baseball player swinging with a donut on his back. And then he would get up to the mound and take the donut, and suddenly it feels super light. So to his credit, I had the braces in. So he made me feel as though I was special because I was constantly practicing with that extra weight on. Right?
It's different to talk when somebody points at you and says, now talk.
Yeah. And that little red light goes on, camera 2, camera 1. And then, hey, it's your job not only to get your line, get your mark, but now you got to throw it over to Juwanza or whoever else was there, right? It was a great experience.
We used to mess with some of the talent sometimes because on our cameras you could hit a button and the red light would come on, but it wasn't really on. So you kind of
Just keep
catch
them
them
on
off
their
guard.
toes.
Yeah, keep them on their toes.
Yeah.
You
You learn
remember?
to turn the mic off too when you walk off the set. Otherwise, everybody gets
Yeah,
all the
the hot
secrets.
mic.
Are you talking about just generally speaking? Did I ever screw up? I screw up all the time.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
part of the process, right? Going from not doing it at all to being like Billy said, now you gotta. But it was a lot of fun. It really was a lot of fun at the time. I'm grateful that I did it, and I didn't really obviously I kind of pursued a different route, but I look back and say, it's funny, my some of my other peers, what sort of jobs they were taking, in the summer of seventh, eighth grade. And I'm glad my dad pushed me into that. And I'm really especially glad. I remember distinctly driving down the Merritt Parkway with my dad in his blue Mercedes, and he had just got the Nora Jones CD. And he loved that Nora Jones CD. And I think he liked the fact that he knew how to work his CD player and that he could burn a disc or whatever it was. So we listened to that thing over and over and over again. So whenever I'm going down the Merritt or whenever I hear songs from that CD, I always think of my dad. So, and I've got a whole bunch of, I didn't know what the heck we're going to talk about, but
Let's
I got a
do
whole
that.
bunch of my
Frank.
dad's,
Let's talk
let's
about
start off with
Frankie's
this one.
grandfather. Come on. What do you think?
You guys
Oh my
see that one?
goodness. Tell Billy
I
about
have one of those.
what
Yeah, I
is
It's a
bet.
50-year membership patch. Is that?
yeah, so
Yeah,
what
that's
we
right.
did, we did about 10 years ago, or maybe we did a precursor to the 100th celebration. And Frank was what, number 3 or 2 or 4? He was pretty low in the totem pole.
He was right there.
What
Seniority 4.
he was a stalwart just about everywhere he went. What can you tell Billy and me about you'll never forget about your dad?
Oh man, where to begin? It's funny. You mentioned well, so I'll start with Wellington. He was always well to dad, right? And it's so funny. You're gonna think I have like Harry Potter, one of those magical sacks where I just keep pulling stuff
Yeah.
out of. I thought you guys would get a kick out of this, and I'll pull it up to the camera here in a second. But what I'm looking at is here. This is a letter on New York Football Giants letterhead dated from February 9th, 1961. And it's from Wellington. It was written to my father. And the reason I bring this up within the context, I know you both are golf fans and have Wingfoot has a special place in both your hearts. And obviously, Wellington was my father's sponsor to Wingfoot. Now that meant I can't tell you what that meant to my dad, being a kid from Bakersfield, California, that he was being sponsored by the owner of the New York Football Giants into the hollow ground that is Wingfoot. And honestly, until the end of his life, he would always, whenever Wingfoot came up, he would always boast. I don't know if boast is the right word, but he would represent proudly that Wellington was his sponsor. It was always in the same sort of breath. I think I've told you that before, Bob. But anyway, the letter here says, Dear Frank, I didn't get a chance to speak to you yesterday to tell you personally how much you have meant to me and to the Giants. You were with us at both ends of the rope, and no player ever did more to bring us from the bottom to the top. From the moment you joined us, I never knew you to be anything but the top. I never knew you to do anything in public or private that did other than reflect credit to yourself and to us. We have had and will have other fine boys and other great players, but I don't think there will be any who could so completely combine the epitome in both. We all wish you the best. You gave nothing less. You are nothing less, and you deserve nothing less. As always, well. And what's kind of neat about that is that was February 9, 1961, after my dad retired for the first time, right? He had the very famous hit by He Who Will Not Be Named,
Mhm.
Bednarik. And everybody thought that was the end. And speaking of broadcasting, everybody, he was working for CBS, I think it
Yeah.
was.
Mhm.
At the time, he had a radio show concurrently while he was playing. And that was sort of, I guess, in some ways, sort of a paradigmatic thing where he was one of the early stars of whatever his sport was, whether it was football or baseball or what have you, transitioning into broadcasting. But I guess he had the itch and he didn't want to give it up, and he obviously came back and played 3 more years after that and was the first ever comeback player of the year. So I think the original question was a memory about dad. I mean, I was just a twinkle in his eye then, but it's kind of fun, especially being home here in Connecticut while we're still here, to go around and I take very good care of my father's memorabilia, and I walk by and pat his. We've got a replica of his bust in the Hall of Fame. We have got one around the corner here, and I got a million stories. So other than that, hopefully you guys get a kick out of that.
Well, I learned something about your dad at this Super Bowl, which I had never. I had heard from Frank a number of times. His early days, he called it the invocation at the Masters, and he did that very well. But your dad did the entire game because he was the on-field reporter. He did reporting each of the 4 quarters. I had never heard that before. How cool is that?
Oh, it's. I mean, it's just kind of surreal to think about, right? You go back to, he would always say, a kid from Bakersfield, and it's sort of like a little bit of Forrest Gump-esque, right? When you think about all these different arenas that he not only participated in but had such great success in. And I say that, of course, just as a proud son. I'm immensely proud to be his son. But what's wild, Bob, I don't know if you know the story. So he had promised the network that he was going to get an interview with Vince Lombardi before the game. So he had, again, this is his big, he had just retired not all that long ago, right? Just a few years ago, maybe 5. The merger was what, 66? This game, right around then, maybe shortly thereafter. Again, I wasn't around, so don't. Someone's going to fact check me at some point, but we're talking mid to late 60s. And he was trying to make a name for himself now in broadcasting. And of course, he knew Vince because Vince had been the offensive coordinator for the Giants. Yeah. So he had special access that the other guys in the media, other guys and gals in the media did not have access to, right? So in the pregame meeting, he said, okay, I've spoken to Vince. Vince is going to give me the interview, and we can count on it. Let's put it on the schedule. So Vince is coming out of the tunnel, and again, I've been hitting the head maybe too many times. It was the LA Memorial Coliseum, wasn't it?
Mm.
Yeah, I'm almost
you're
positive.
Right.
So
we'll check it out.
Vince is coming out of the tunnel, and Dad goes up to him, and he brings a microphone up, and Vince waves him off. And so, and Dad said, nah, and he chased after him. Dad was pretty quick, and Vince was kind of lumbering over. So he catches up to Vince, and then you mentioned there was actually another network that was covering the game. There were 2 different networks covering the game, right? So one of the other reporters, I forget who it was, bolted after because he saw what was happening. So I guess he only got the other reporter got just a fraction of what my dad caught with Vince. But my dad said Vince was as white as a ghost. He was so nervous for this game because I think even then, and a lot of who calls Vince Lombardi nervous, right? I mean, he's sort of the epitome of ice water. But Dad knew him in a different way, and I think Dad knew his ticks and had spent enough time with him. He called him a very, very dear friend. But I think Vince had, what's cool in that story, I think, is that Vince had the foresight to know what this game was going to mean for the NFL. Right. And guys like Pete Rozelle and Vince and, all those guys back then, who are now still to this day on the Mount Rushmore of the NFL and sort of define the way we know and consume and recognize and love the NFL today. A lot of it was, you can kind of trace a straight line back to really the late 50s and the advent of television, and then the merger, and then the Super Bowl being presided over like guys like Rozelle. And my dad was fortunate to be along for the ride at a perfect time in history, right? First as a player, and then as a broadcaster, and then on 27 years of Monday night. So stop me at any time. I can.
No, I think I disagree with you on one thing. I think you're being too humble. They talk about Arnold Palmer and what Tiger Woods has done to the game, but Tiger Woods, in a real honest moment, would say he came from a platform that Arnold Palmer built. And your father was beyond football. He was beyond, obviously, he was the top guy. He wasn't a great golfer, but he was one of the top guys at the Masters. He could get an interview, and he was also, the Hollywood. He had so much charisma, just like Palmer had. The time was right, like for Palmer too, and he came around the same time. But I think Frank did to football and to other sports that he was involved in, the same kind of thing. That's why I disagree with you. I think his charm, his magnetism, and his charisma was also part and parcel of the right time,
as well as his appreciation of the game.
Yep. Yeah, well said. Well said. But better you saying it than me, Bob.
Well, you know what he would say about some of these announcers today. Bobby, they talk too much.
Yeah, they talk too much. I'll give just as in a complete aside, you guys get a kick out of this. As my dad got older and older, I told you, before we hopped on here, my wife and I, we lived in California for over a decade, and we've only recently come back, and it's been a product of the pandemic, and we've kind of been maintaining our place here. But I have a very fond memory of my dad. I walked in and he was watching the news, really intently focused on whatever he was watching. But here's the kicker: the mute button had been activated, so he's watching the news and he's just locked in to whatever the hell's going on. And I kind of watched him there for a beat. And again, he's advanced age at that point. And I said, Dad, what are you doing? He said, I'm watching the news. I said, well, why do you have the mute button on? He goes, because I've heard it all before.
Are you a big classic, you know, 60, 70-year-old movies years ago type of guy? Do you like the classic movies, or what do you?
I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think a good movie is a good movie irrespective of when it was made, right? I don't like a movie simply because it was born out of a certain era or what have you. And I think there are masters in every generation, right? And the auteur theory and all of that. I mean, that's some highfalutin stuff, right? And I mean, as a consumer, a good movie is a good movie. As a creator, I mean, I'm trying to think. Oof, I mean, the obvious ones like Sunset Boulevard go, Billy Wilder and things like Matt Preston Sturges, directors and films. I mean, we different periods. We go all the way back to the earlier studio days, and I mean, I did my degree in cinema studies at SC way back when, and we can go all the way back to like the Lumiere brothers and D.W. Griffith, and so you fire away, man. If I'm out of water on some of these, I'll tell you. But
Billy, have at it.
what do you
You
guys like?
you just described what we were actually talking about with your dad and Arnold Palmer is the platform from which all these other movies came. So as John Wolfe, who I mentioned before, once said to me, you see slapstick and you think, how silly. But think of the first guy that proposed that to somebody. Walks in an office and says, you know what we ought to do? We ought to have the guy tip over in his chair, slide across the room, bang his head on the wall, have a clock fall on his head, bowling ball rolls back,
Yeah,
they would have looked at him like he had two heads. And yet slapstick came along and became a whole genre. So pioneers are necessary. And the guys today who interpret the what I would call the guts of a movie and make movies based on that are the guys that I really appreciate today and from back then.
mm-hmm.
That are more interested in plot twists, camera angles, and all of that than they are in celebrity roles.
Yeah.
Sometimes, as I've said to Bob before, sometimes a movie's more about the actor than the movie, and I don't think that should ever be true. I think the movie, like the sport, is the important thing, and I think the movie is the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be substance. It doesn't have to have a message. It just has to be entertaining. And there's so many movies that are entertaining, today and back then. But yeah, I'm
I
like
think
you.
about too with even going not just in service of the story, but in service of their fellow actors and creators and technicians. Like you look at how United Artists was founded, right? With
Yeah,
Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, right? The
Yeah.
wanting to take power away that had sort of been monopolized in these homes where
yeah, they
they
were
were
subject to contracts.
they were traded like commodities. The
Yes,
stars were, right. So bringing that agency back, and then you have this flourishing of really really amazing product thereafter when you give the creators the ability to go and do what they want to do and what they're inspired to do, and then and then with that, of course, then come along the talent agents and then the whole thing. And
sure.
but yeah, I'm totally what is, I mean, what's in service of the story, of the story, of the story, of the story. Um, not just having it
Yeah,
be a.
I think today, we usually lean towards classic movies, and you always say Alfred Hitchcock and Billy Wilder. I think Guy Ritchie and the Coen brothers today are the ones that attract my attention the most. Quentin Tarantino to a degree, although sometimes he's a little extreme, but who tells a story better than Guy Ritchie these days?
Mm,
The way he presents the story, the
mhm,
plot lines are good, the characters are always terrific,
yeah.
pure entertainment.
What do you think of The Gentleman?
I loved it.
I did too. I was so surprised by it. I knew nothing other than I see the cast, and then I
Yep.
know it's a Guy Ritchie movie. And I remember walking in, I watched it by myself in Santa Monica. I think it was right before the pandemic.
Yep.
And Erica, my wife, was away with her family that weekend. I said, you know what? I haven't been to the movies in God knows how long, and I miss it. And it was a Guy Ritchie movie. And I remember walking out right onto Ocean Avenue there in Santa Monica and thinking that was a fantastic movie.
It's funny you say that because I hadn't been to the movies in a long time either, but I always keep my eye out for, as I tell my kids, Godzilla or King Kong. I have to go. I'm obligated. Or Guy Ritchie. So I went with a friend and saw The Gentleman, and I liked it the way you did so much. I actually went back and saw it again the next day in the
Mm,
movie theater. So I've been to the movie theater maybe 10 times in 10 years, and two of them were 2 days in a row for that movie.
yeah,
I think
yeah,
Colin Firth was ridiculously funny in that movie. I mean,
right,
Colin
right.
Farrell.
Uh-huh. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the Coen brothers too. And I was reading about, it was maybe in Business Insider or something. There was an article with Denis Villeneuve, the great French Canadian filmmaker who's now like the hottest director in Hollywood. And he really is he's a student, of the history of film. He knows his stuff, obviously. I mean, the guy's one of the best on planet Earth right now. But he was saying that No Country for Old Men was probably one of the best movies. I forget what it was of. It was either in the last 50 years or maybe his all-time list, and he ranked it. If not at I'll have to go back and check that, Bob. I'll send you a link after, either at the top or very, very near the top. And I remember thinking, I think that came out in 2006 or seven, if I'm not mistaken. I remember seeing it when I was in high school, and wow, I mean,
There's two really kind of interesting features in that movie that are not mentioned or understated. There's no musical soundtrack.
mhm.
There's the only music in it is when he wakes up in Mexico and he's a Mexican band playing as part of the movie. And the other kind of unique thing is the three leading characters in that movie: Javier Bardem, Tommy Lee Jones, and Barbara Streisand's son. I can't remember his name right now. How do I not remember? But anyway, the three leading characters are never in the same scene together.
Mhm.
They're never on the screen at the same time together, which is very odd for a movie when you
That's
think
by
the three.
design, though. That wasn't
It
by
sure is.
accident. That's by
What is
design.
it, Bob?
That was by design, not by accident.
No, yeah, no,
Oh
everything they
yeah,
do is
very
by
much
design. Yeah,
so. And you end up watching it, and at the end you think, okay, who really was it? Not in terms of pure screen time, but who really was the protagonist of that movie? And I think it's Tommy Lee Jones, right?
yeah, yeah. And he
Yeah.
tells that story about his father in the dream, and so actually
Oh
he was the younger man.
yeah, exactly.
And that's the title of the movie, No Country
Right.
for Old Men. Is that's Tommy Lee Jones. He's like, I don't want to come across something I don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
that's a terrific movie.
Yeah.
You
Agreed.
need a strong
Agreed.
stomach for it, but it's terrific. And
Well, to just I mean, just anytime Javier Bardem is on screen, yeah, you need to get your
his yeah
Pepsi.
he's unbelievable.
I don't know if it was you and Alvaro or the other brother about carnal knowledge. And I feel a little guilty because I'm watching that now because I really never watched that movie. But, who thought Art Garfunkel might be a good actor, right? And I love Jack Nicholson and Candice Bergen. I don't think she ever looked better in her whole life. And then Anne Margaret, oh my goodness. And that to me, wow, you could spend days on that movie, right?
It's a punchline in one of the All in the Family episodes where Archie comes back with Edith, like, how could you take me to a movie like that? I
uh,
had to watch the movie like this. No one was ever standing up. She was like, I thought it was a religious movie, Cardinal Knowledge. It's not
Yeah,
cardinal knowledge. Cardinal's a completely different thing.
right, right. Not quite.
But
But you reminded me of that story about Cuba because didn't you say to me you have the you don't have we can delete this if you don't want it to be known, but about the Johnny Roselli book.
No, 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 don't delete it. We'll give it a good plug. How about that? Let's
yeah,
see. I
let's do
think I
that.
got it. I got to
You got to tell Billy
it's
the
called
background.
All American Mafioso, the Johnny Roselli story. And what this is, and for those who don't know, Johnny Roselli was the National Crime Syndicate's man in Las Vegas. And he was always the guy behind the guy. He's not as well known, um, I guess, by the layman, people who don't really focus on mafia stories. He's not like an Al Capone or a
Bugsy.
Bugsy Siegel or Sam Giancana. Although in many ways he was just as influential. He was also the guy whom the CIA hired when the CIA wanted to assassinate Fidel
Castro.
Castro,
Yeah.
and they wanted to decapitate the Castro regime prior to an amphibious invasion, which ultimately
Yeah.
became known as the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, and the
So
mafia's interest was to get their casinos back down in Cuba.
that's exactly right. Cuba was Las Vegas before Las Vegas really blossomed because it was completely deregulated under the Batista regime, right? It was a free for all. And it was I guess you'd call it maybe unbridled excess.
Mm-hmm.
And the mafia moved in with guys like Giancana, and Rosselli was sort of an emissary. He worked beneath Giancana out of Chicago, but then they sent him out west, and he was managing the affairs on the West Coast. Absolutely bananas, this guy's life story in different stages. I mean, he was at he ends up shaking down Columbia Pictures and Harry Cohn for essentially operating control over the studio. So people don't realize that prior to the Great Depression happens, 1929, 1930, the stock market crashes, the depression ensues, and Harry Cohn is looking to buy out his brother out of Columbia Pictures. And who's liquid at the time after the crash? Who has cash, right? Wall Street's not too keen on it. The mafia, the National Crime Syndicate. So Rosselli ends up brokering a deal for the mafia to become a silent partner in Columbia Pictures all through the 1930s. And they're staying again behind the scenes up until they get caught, which they do get caught. And he ends up also infiltrating IATSE, which is sort of the stagehands and the projectionist union, right?
An
So
International Alliance for Stage and Theatrical Employees.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
They end up planting a guy, and Billy, stop me if you know this already. I'm sure you do. They end up planting a guy named Willie Byoff in as president of IATSE, while Rosselli is secretly pulling the puppet strings on Columbia Pictures. And what this would allow the mafia to do, and we're talking now again 1930s, early 1940s, leading up to World War II. What this would allow the mafia to do would be to cook up or at least threaten the prospect of a projectionist strike. So
Uh-huh.
you can pour all the money you want into making a movie and cutting a film and scoring it and doing everything you want. But if the projectionists are going to walk out of the movie theaters en masse,
Yeah.
you're not going to recoup anything.
Right.
So he would leverage that position against the studios. And I kid you not, this is all based on this starts not congressional testimony, but this was one of the greatest extortion schemes in the history of the US legal system. And I'm so surprised that people don't know more about it because they do end up getting caught. But Johnny Rosselli and his coterie, they were shaking down the studios for $50,000-$100,000 a year in cash. Guys like Jack Warner and his associates, whether it was Warner Brothers, whether it was Paramount, RKO, all the biggies back in the day, they would fly out personally to Manhattan and they would leave a bag of cash in his hotel suite every year so that they could quell a potential labor union that was orchestrated by the mafia. Wow. The kicker to that also is that all through the 1930s, you can hear my enthusiasm, when the mafia had silent control over Colombia, they never lost money. They were always in the black. And obviously, that you're talking about Marilyn Monroe getting her start, and you're talking about Frank Sinatra having his resurgence. This is not conspiracy. This is a matter of public record. And that is only the first phase of Johnny Rosselli's life until like I said, they ultimately get caught. They spend a few years in prison. They make a few phone calls. They get out on parole or whatever it is that they do. And they're not allowed to go back to Los Angeles. So where do they go? They go to a little outpost in the middle of the Nevada desert called Las Vegas. And they take the racket on the road and enter Bugsy Siegel and the Flamingo and the Desert Sands and the Golden Nugget. And that's basically, that's the evolution, right? What started in Los Angeles spread to Nevada. And then 1959, 1960, Fidel Castro comes roaring into Havana, and Johnny Rosselli gets a phone call from a guy named Bob Mayhew. Bob Mayhew was a former FBI agent and officer, I believe, in the OSS during World War II. He spent his time killing Nazis. He gets a call from Bob, who is Howard Hughes's number 2. And he says he wants to have lunch at a place called the Brown Derby restaurant in Beverly Hills. So they sit down for lunch together, Mayhew and Rosselli do. And Bob Mayhew says the U.S. government needs your help to kill a sovereign leader. And that sovereign leader was Fidel Castro. And there's a lot of debate over who actually put that order, sent that down the wire.
Just getting to Johnny Fontaine never gets that part.
That's right. Yeah, with a horse. There's a horse missing a head somewhere. Yeah. So they're at the Brown Derby. And by the way, this all really happened. This is a matter of congressional record, which came out during the Church Committee testimonies, which was a Senate investigation into the improprieties in the intelligence community in the latter half of the last century.
So just go back 2 steps. Who's at the lunch at the Brown Derby again?
Johnny Rosselli.
Yeah.
Johnny Rosselli and a guy named Bob Mayhew. And Bob Mayhew was a cutout for the CIA. He had top secret clearance, and he was somebody the CIA used to, shall we say, interact or interface with criminal enterprises when the CIA didn't want to get their hands dirty. So you can understand what was happening in 1960. There was a presidential election that year. So this was, and I was saying there's some debate over who is the progenitor of this plan. Well, Richard Nixon was the vice president at the time under Ike. A lot of people say this was Nixon's idea. The election happens. Kennedy wins, of course. The die had already been cast leading up to the Bay of Pigs. So this was all in motion. So there are accusations that this was Jack Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy. They were the inheritors of this plan, right? Because Nixon was notoriously hawkish on Cuba and in communism more broadly. So the story, and I showed you the book. My partner and I, my writing partner, John C. Richards, who wrote Paterno for HBO and Sahara for Paramount with Matthew McConaughey and Penelope Cruz, an absolutely fantastic writer. I got the rights to this book a few years ago. We developed it during the pandemic, and we're just now going out with it, doing the Dog and Pony show and doing a pitch. And we've got some other some pretty cool people attached to it now. We found a director, and I don't want to get too over my skis and making those announcements, but it's come a long way. But the story is about this ragtag group of spies and mafiosos hunkered down in South Florida and in Miami and in Key Largo, basically running clandestine operations to and from Cuba, trying to whack Castro. And all of the ancillary things that come off of that spine, which are, again, conspiracy theories surrounding what happened to JFK, which, by the way, are becoming more and more, or I guess I should say, less and less conspiratorial and more mainstream by the day as more and more information comes out. It's a very, very topical story about all of the stuff that goes on beneath the surface of American politics and geopolitics, right? So I've always been interested in that. I've always been interested, what is the real story? What is the real story? And we're basing our whole take on what we can prove people actually said. We're not deciding one way or another, this happened exactly this way, but this is exactly what this guy said happened at this point in time. And everybody can go and do their homework and see that we're not fudging it. So it is a crazy, crazy banana story. And I hope the next time I'm on, if you invite me back on, I hope it'll be on some streamer somewhere.
It must be like peeling back an onion, though. Everywhere you look, you find more.
A really stinky onion, Billy, because
Yeah.
I'll give you a spoiler alert. Rosselli, they find him dismembered in an oil drum floating off of Dumfoundling Bay right by Fort Lauderdale. And that was, guess what? That was 1 week after he testified to a closed Senate committee hearing on the assassination of JFK.
There you
And
go.
it was just shortly after Sam Giancana was shot twice in the back of the head in his Chicago home, and then plugged, I think, 5 more times in the shape of a smile around his mouth. So
And
there's a
is this
lot more to
before
the
or
story.
after Kennedy was killed?
No, 1960 to 1963 is really the scope of when the meat and potatoes of all these operations were taking place. Obviously, Kennedy is assassinated in 63. Flash forward, the church committee's happening about maybe 12, I think 12, 13 years later. And I think Rosselli is ultimately killed in 76 or 77. But really interesting. I mean, I think any fan of American history, or true American history, kind of people who want to know the truth about what happened. I go into every meeting when I'm trying to sell this project and say, all right, I promise you I'm not one of those people with a tinfoil hat on. And then I'll send him a PDF of the congressional record and the testimony of all of the government agents who came with their head between, tail between their legs saying, yeah, we did try to do this. The exploding cigars, Castro's exploding cigars are real. His mistress that we recruited to kill him did get cold feet, and she ended up not killing him, but making love to him. So I don't know what else to say.
So are you thinking
Castro dodged a lot of bullets.
this
sure
could
did.
be like a series, Cody? Because it doesn't sound like it's a one-shot movie. Or would you think it?
No, good question. What we want to do is we want to do it. Well, I told you how it ends for Rosselli, but what we want to do is do it as a 10-episode limited, with the idea being that you can take that template and apply it to other instances of what is the real story behind the nexus between organized crime and the U.S. government working together.
Yeah.
So there are, unfortunately, other instances where that took place, and really begs the question, when the U.S. government is subcontracting murder, it's like, who really is the gangster and who's the patriot? And that's the other kind of interesting part of Rosselli's story, is that he was born in Italy, came over the transatlantic crossing. His father was a shoemaker working at a factory in East Boston, slaving away to bring his family over from the Cosa Nostra, really to get them away from mafia influence in Italy. And they come over early. Rosselli's born in 1905. I think they come over sometime in the mid-19 teens. And right when Rosselli and his mom and his siblings get here, his father dies in 1918 in the last great pandemic this country saw.
Whoa.
So he ends up, you have this young boy in East Boston who doesn't speak English, who's now the eldest and has to take care of his mother, who shacks up with a boyfriend who's beating the hell out of her, and his siblings. So he tries to take his father's job at the factory, and then he tries to also get a job wearing his father's dairy uniform, delivering milk. And he realizes very quickly he can make a hell of a lot more money selling morphine on the docks than he can doing that. And it's that decision that he makes which ends up leading, again, in a straight line all the way at the end of his life to being in a barrel. But what he always loved is that when he did have time with his father, when he came over to America, he always believed in this great dream that was the American dream. And his father desperately believed in it, that hard work and that ethos one could elevate oneself to great things in this country, which I certainly subscribe to. And I think I would imagine both of you guys do too. But when the government comes around at the end of his life, this is a guy who volunteered to fight in this is a criminal who volunteered to fight in World War II because he believed in the cause, and he was denied because he had tuberculosis. So when the government comes around, they offer him $150,000 cash to do this. And he turns it down. He doesn't want the money. He says he'll do it out of a sense of patriotism. And the government didn't believe him. They said that we can't imagine that you would be so honorable as to do that. And to his credit, he paid his own way. And every time he was going back and forth to Las Vegas to Miami, he didn't take a dime.
There's a difference between organized crime and disorganized crime.
Yeah, maybe. So
we know that you got to get some places here. There's so many things. Just imagine if Rosselli shut the cameras down. Marilyn Monroe would never be heard of, or maybe Frank Sinatra. Just imagine the things. Just imagine if the girlfriend came through and killed Castro, what it would be like. Just imagine the other side of the coin of all these things in this story that you're already well aware of.
Yep.
It's fabulous. So let's transition. We're gonna wrap this up with the Arnold Palmer story. You got to tell us.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's
Frank Gifford. I know you got millions of Frank Gifford stories, and that's why you're coming back, along with, more importantly, this Johnny Roselli story. Whatever you're going to make it out as, we're going to hear more about that. But it's all yours on this story. Go ahead.
All right, I'll be brief. I promise. No, you mentioned Arnold Palmer earlier when you were so very kindly being complimentary of Dad. Being one of the people who kind of built up the game and the infrastructure in the NFL. And my wife and I guess then girlfriend, we were at a place called the Greenbrier in West Virginia. Beautiful, yeah, exactly. Beautiful old hotel and resort. And we're there for the wedding of a dear friend of my wife's. And we're getting in the elevator, and out walks Arnold Palmer and Lee Trevino.
Wow.
And they're walking down the hall, and I think, you know what? I've never met him. Bob, like you said, he's in his element here. He's here to relax. Everybody and their mother is going to go bother these guys. But I told Erica, I just finished telling Erica, because I think I had heard that he was at the hotel. And I had finished telling Erica, that my dad had called, of course, some of his matches. And she kind of elbowed me. She's like, you got to go introduce yourself. And that's, Bob, you know me, that's like the last thing, because people would do it to my parents. And I was very sensitive to that. And I said, you know what? The guy is, whether he's the GOAT or not, that's for debate for you guys to have another time. But I went over to him and I introduced myself, and I said, excuse me, sir. It's a pleasure to meet, sirs, it's a pleasure to meet you both. I'm just in awe of what you guys have accomplished. And whatever I said, I probably sounded like an idiot, like I do now. But I said, and they're both very, gentlemanly, of course, and very respectful. But they're kind of looking at me like, all right, here's just some other schmuck who's coming up to bother us when we're on our vacation, on our way to dinner or whatever. And then I ended by saying, my father had the great fortune to call some of your matches. And it was Arnold who turned around and he said, oh yeah, what's your father's name? And I said, my father's Frank Gifford. And his eyes got really big. Same with Lee's. And Lee came over and gave me a hug. And I think it was either his son or his daughter who was just on their way to USC or was thinking about going to USC, University of Southern California. And they were just the coolest guys you can ever imagine. And Arnold Palmer, I'll never forget, he said, when you see your father, you please say that I said hello to him. And that's like, sounds silly, but the way he's Arnold Palmer, right? The way he said it and the way he looked, there was like a genuine degree of recognition and respect that this guy had for my dad, and the reverence that I had for Arnold. Like, it was by transitive property, almost like channeling through. I'm like, wow, this is really, really neat. And the fact that Lee had that connection to USC was super cool. So it's a silly story. It's kind of one where you had to almost experience it, but I told Erica afterwards, my wife, I said, it was so cool to see both of these guys have the kind of respect, the evident respect that they had for my dad. It just made me, it's hard not to feel warm and fuzzy when something like that happens. So,
well, when you see Erica after you part from us here, tell her, thanks.
Nice nudge.
Thanks for the elbow.
Yeah.
Because we're out the elbow, you're not going to do that. And look at how great that story is. And I'm not pretty sure they really appreciated those moments that you shared with them too.
I'd be nothing if not for that elbow. I'm a sucker for that woman. She's my better half in the best of all ways. So, guys, it was such a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today.
Billy Harmon.
We really appreciate your
Double
feedback.
Indemnity.
And please
Arky.
subscribe to the
Two
show
Outer.
and hit
Claude
the bell
Harmon.
icon so you get notified
Movie
of
Classics.
new episodes.
Mark Gable.
Hit them
Odd
hard
Job.
and hit them off.
Best 36 holes.